Good afternoon, and welcome to our next installment of Influenced by OUTFRONT, Politics, Media, and the Pandemic. My name is RB. I'm the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs for the U.S. and Canada for OUTFRONT Media, and I'll be your moderator today. I am extremely ecstatic to be joined by our distinguished guests. First, Abel Maldonado. Abel was elected to the California State Assembly in 1998 and served for 3 terms, after which he was elected to the State Assembly for 2 terms. Abel Maldonado was sworn into as California's Lieutenant Governor on April 27, 2010. Next, Jessica Tarlov. Jessica is Vice President, Insights at Bustle Digital Group. Her group provides meaningful insights and research into what drives purchase habits, brand consideration, and overall opinions across BDG's 9 properties. Jessica also appears regularly as a contributor on Fox News, representing a refreshing moderate liberal take on the issues of today. And in 2017, Jessica published her first book, America in the Age of Trump. Danny Jester, partner, GMMB. Danny's media planning expertise encompasses some of the best campaigns across politics, advocacy, and awareness. Danny led the media buy-in effort for the Obama of America in both 2008 and 2012. And last but not least, my good friend, Eric Jaye, founder, SpeakEasy Political Media. SpeakEasy Political Media democratizes the political process by making it cheaper and easier for campaigns to use top-of-the-line political tools for communicating with voters. As a reminder, after our 30-minute conversation with our panelists, the audience will have an opportunity to provide questions to the panelists. This year has been a very trying year, as we all know. As the saying says, may we live in interesting times. We have a global pandemic. We have a presidential campaign with a very unconventional president running against a seasoned Vice President of the United States. We have the Black Lives Matter movement that started in May 20 after the death of George Floyd. My first question goes to Jessica. Jessica, given the current season, what are your thoughts on the current state of the race, and what issues do you really think matter to voters?
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the whole OUTFRONT team for having us here today to participate in this incredibly important discussion. I'm going to take your second question first, which is what issues matter most to voters, and how you kicked off the conversation about what kind of a year this is by starting with a global health pandemic is really the answer to that. Healthcare has been the most important issue to American voters the last 3 years running. It's the reason that Democrats were able to take back the House in 2018, and it continues to be the most important issue when asked. Second most important issue is the economy, which is usually the first most important issue, but we have a global health pandemic, so people are thinking about that first. So those are the 2 things that American voters are focused on, and they're intertwined, right? We know the statistics about how little money Americans have to make in case that they have a medical emergency. Most can't even make it through a $400 ER bill if that showed up. So it makes sense that those 2 are working in tandem. As for the state of the race, and I can't wait to hear the insights on this from the rest of our panelists, I would call it as stable as any candidate could possibly hope for. That's in Joe Biden's favor, but with some tightening around the edges as of late in swing states. So that's not particularly surprising, since Labor Day is usually the kickoff of the official campaign season. It's just that we live in a world where people spend $1 billion trying to get elected to office. So we've been running campaigns the whole time. But we've seen tightening in Pennsylvania and Florida, for instance, but a remarkably steady race in Joe Biden's favor at this moment, is what I would say. Though as a Democrat, I remain extremely fearful that we could have a popular vote win for Joe Biden and then electoral college loss like happened to Hillary Clinton. Maybe not those same 3 states, but we could come up with some other combinations of ways that it'll happen.
That's great. Lieutenant Governor Maldonado, you run for, state senate, state assembly, governor, for Congress. How do you see in the state of politics a very moderate California? What do you see happen at national?
Well, first of all, I was heavily involved in politics, as you stated, Ryan, and all of a sudden I'm out of politics for about 3 or 4 years, but obviously still reading the newspapers, Twitter, and so forth. And as I look at the race today, it would honestly think that it would be a slam dunk for Joe Biden when you got all these Republicans coming out there and supporting him, and you have all these new entrants coming from everywhere, and the race is tightening up. And as Jessica stated, obviously Labor Day, it kicks off, it tightens up, and then we're going to see the ebb and flow. But when you have you look at, again, I want to emphasize this. I'm not in the inside, so I'm going to give you my perspective of being on the outside, formerly being on the inside. So when you have the Trump voter out there, he said it right 4 years ago. I can shoot somebody on Central Park and they'll still vote for me. That hasn't changed. Those people are going to go to the polls, and no matter what happens, they're going to vote for him. The question is there enough of the other to defeat Donald Trump? Now, you have to understand, I was interviewed by President Trump to be Secretary of Agriculture, and I became number 2 next to Sonny Perdue. And I've witnessed him one-on-one. And I like to say that there's 2 different characters here, the one that you see on camera and the one that you see when you get interviewed by him. But let me share something with you. As Jessica said, the economy is always number 1. I just left Lowe's this morning. A lady asked me, what are you doing? I said, I'm not doing anything. I said, what are you worried about? She said, COVID-19. So it is healthcare. It is the biggest issue out there today, followed by the economy. And the question, RB, is can Joe show some strength? Because from what I hear on the street is he's weak. That's something that I haven't seen in the past, but he needs to get strong if he wants to have a strong showing, because that's the only issue I hear out there. Now on Trump, man, you can just take it for whatever you want. You hear everything out there about the guy. And it's just how I feel. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from the panelists and see where we end up on this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Governor. That leads me to the question, how are we reaching our voters? Eric, Jaye, and Danny, this is what you guys do. Eric, Danny, and, ran Obama's campaign strategy in 2008, 2012. Eric, Jaye, you've done national campaigns and local campaigns. What tools are you using to reach those voters? Is it digital? Is it social media? Is it outdoor? Eric, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, certainly, if we want to get into the weeds, we're doing a lot more digital media than we've done before, in part because fewer voters are persuadable. The channels that we use to persuade people have tended to be more broadcast television. These days, with only a handful of voters actually being persuadable or open to argument, we're using more and more tools that allow us to activate our base voters. Trump talks about his base. We have a base as well in the Democratic Party. I'm part of the Democratic Party. And so we're tending to use tools that allow people to respond to us, to give, to pledge, to join. And I think that has largely fueled the rise of digital. But in the broadest sense, Ryan, I think we're dealing with an environment where the voters are increasingly skeptical. We talk about fake news. We don't talk as much as we should about fake advertising or the perception that what's being said is fake, and the confirmation bias that's so strong in the electorate and amongst consumers. And most people are tuning out anything that doesn't seem initially like they should agree with it. And so it's very difficult to reach voters. And so we're having to find ways to engage them in a dialogue, which is more digital, and also find ways to prove to them that what we're saying is true, which is a longer format discussion.
Yeah, and Eric, I'm glad you mentioned that, and especially mentioning digital. We've had an explosion of local digital billboards. It's a way to reach voters. Trust it. People retweet it. Are you seeing some of the same things for the campaigns that you're running?
Again, we are seeing that. I mean, it's not that we don't encourage all of our clients to run multi-channel campaigns, right? It's very, very difficult to reach voters or consumers for that matter. And it's important to surround them with broadcast TV, cable TV, pre-roll, social, programmatic digital, outdoor, and probably most importantly, peer-to-peer. There's been a number of studies on this about what people actually believe. And you know, the number one way that people are getting political information these days is not through any kind of paid media, but essentially through promoted peer-to-peer communication. You don't believe the ad that you see, but you believe what your neighbor says, and you are likely to try to, frankly, model what your neighbor is doing. And so we're using all of the channels, RB, but I think we're using them differently. We're no longer presuming that the message itself is going to persuade anybody. We're really working to promote long format conversations from peers to other peers if we need to change minds. Because if it's just what we say, good luck, folks. The audience is skeptical, and you're going to need to get someone they trust to repeat what you're saying. And that's changed how we've used media and how we're buying it.
So, Danny, you were really instrumental in Obama's, re-election in 2008 and in 2012. What type of media did you use to reach those voters?
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with what Eric's saying 100%. I mean, I also worked on the Clinton campaign in 2016, and obviously a very different story there. And we had to deal with new forms of misinformation out there in a very different way. I mean, look, video is how candidates are better known, especially in today's world where with COVID and the shutdowns and people are not out at events and they're not, at rallies and they're not, there's not a lot of canvassing being done right now. Paid media is how people are getting that message, and video is a critical piece of that. And outside of, what we can do with the traditional forms of paid media in the 30-second spot, I agree with Eric in that there is a longer form message that needs to be kind of relayed to voters, whether it's done through a forced mechanism or a push mechanism, or it's done with a conversation, and that can be through phone banks and peer-to-peer and SMS and things like this, additional like follow-up conversations, so there's a little bit more of engagement there. But in today's world, we've seen video be the place where we're going to influence, where people can feel, not only just see and hear the candidate, but also feel the candidate. And so finding more ways to do that. And what we've seen in the last year is we've seen connected TV, streaming video, and things like that increase by almost 100%. It's almost doubled in a year from March to March this year. And so that's a place where we're kind of gaining new viewers, because there are a lot of people who've checked out of broadcast TV, who've cut the cord, and finding new ways to get them in. And that's what the digital space and streaming video allows, not only to have the power of TV and be on that living room screen and the lean back passive form of communication, but also be able to target them beyond just the media market level. So that's been really, really powerful tool, and now we can do that at scale. So,
yeah, and Danny, I'm going to follow up on that question really quick. On your response, you talk about people still using the medium of television, but in this fall we have no news shows. There's no anchor shows to get people around. We're all watching reruns. We're all watching Netflix if we're watching TV at all. We've seen an explosion of people coming as they're driving, getting back to work, using outdoor advertising. They're using the billboards, or they're using your mobile, where we're geofencing people. Are you seeing that in your area also?
Look, I think political advertising and billboards historically have not been a team together as well, because it's basically, there is a more complicated message that usually a candidate has to get out, or a group has to get out. It's not, you can't boil it down to 10 or 11 words. However, I do think with what happened in 2016, I think people are looking at outdoor in a different way, and also the digital outdoor space is also changing. You can put videos on gas stations, and you can put them in movie theaters, and you can put them in convenience stores and retail outlets and things like that. So you can actually get that sight, sound, and motion, and get that feeling and actually have an influential conversation with a potential voter. So I think that's changing. But I also think, there might be more uses of the traditional billboard, because I think when you drove around in 2016, we've all seen this story. There were Trump signs all over the place. There were not anywhere near as many Clinton signs. And so that gave you this feeling of a different level of excitement about a candidate. And I do think, I see a very different world now. I see a lot more Biden signs out there, but I think it's also going to happen in outdoor, because it kind of plays into that same space. So I think there's an opportunity both for digital outdoor, and I think there's an opportunity for static outdoor to kind of be a bigger player this year.
Can I add to that really quickly? So I think that's really important. We're constantly having conversations about signs of popularity that are absolutely false flags, right? Like this year, it's Trump boat parades versus, Biden's golf carts. How many yard signs is either campaign selling, et cetera. And the fundraising dollars are really what you have to pay attention to, and where they're spending that money. That's all that matters. Whether you see 100 boats out in your local river with whoever's flag on it, that's not how elections are decided. And I think, Danny's saying something, and Eric, both really important about digital. And as someone who works at a cable news network, I believe the impact of TV, and especially cable news with this president in particular, who watches it all day and all night when he should be working, makes it appear that it has an outsized influence, and it does. The cable news audience is very small. The clips get cut up and they get reproduced on, other networks, like they'll show up on late night TV. The Daily Show covers them, and podcasts will talk about them with a lot of influence. Like Joe Rogan talks about things that are happening on cable news and reaches millions and millions of people. But I think that there is this false feeling that whatever's happening on Anderson Cooper's hour at 8 p.m. is actually what is deciding the future of the election. And it's not. It's being fought in these digital places where people can be reached in their homes, especially during COVID. And I just wanted to note that from the TV perspective, and also working there, that I'm acutely aware of the fact that I'm speaking to a very small crowd at any particular moment, even though it feels so big.
That is so true. But, I do have a question. I think Eric might have brought this up. We know Facebook, Twitter, and all the social media platforms have started to fact check ads. Is this a good thing? Is it censorship? And, where should the platform go?
Well, I'll jump in, Ryan. I personally think it's a very good thing. I think what Google did also was a very productive thing for our democracy. They essentially limited your ability to target your messages. And I don't think that was the intended consequence of these networks, but that's what happened, is the algorithms became so powerful that we were able to run very, very tightly targeted messages to individual groups without fear of backlash in the broader population. And people like us, people in our business, and certainly the platforms who sold us the inventory as well, need to take responsibility for the fact that part of how we were running and winning campaigns was tearing this country apart. We were basically able to speak to people's tribal instincts in a way that's created a toxic political environment. And so as we step back and say, well, okay, that's not ending well, we really are going to need to go back to the future where there's more responsibility to be completely transparent about where you stand. Now, brands do that every day, and they have one message for one audience largely, but politicians have gotten away from that. And fact checking helps to the extent that people believe it, and to the extent that you can find a fact checker who knows how to do more than Google something, that's its own problem. But I think beyond that, Ryan, it's just the self-regulation of the platforms themselves that require the advertisers not to parse their audiences to the point that we're activating people's reptilian brains. And that has happened.
I would add one more thing. I do think the paid advertising on social media, I do think it's a good start. But I think the war is not being fought there. The war is being fought in private comments that are being pushed around and spread throughout the world. And any fact check you can put out there, you can always find a startup newspaper that is actually not really a newspaper or a publisher that does the other side. And that's a real problem. And so when you start to limit paid advertising and what you can do in terms of targeting. And now Facebook has a new rule for the last basically weekend of the election where you can't add new advertisers and you can't add new messages for the last final stretch. I understand why you're doing it, but it hurts the Democratic Party because the Republican Party and the Trump supporters are relying on the ability that they're spreading information within their groups in a more organic way. And the Democrats just don't have that scale that they do. And so it does limit one side more than another. And I guess we'll see how this all turns out. But it feels like it does hurt the Democratic side more than the other side.
Great. So Jessica, what do you think, and Abel, what are kind of the next steps and how are we going to reach our voters out there? I mean, what, solid messages, it's the economy, it's the pandemic, what mediums are we going to use to get those voters?
Well, I think that the candidates are signaling to us and more Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that we are going to return to as much normal campaigning as possible. I think that, them starting to go on the road a couple weeks even before Labor Day, and granted the riots in Kenosha really sparked that Joe Biden had to show up there and be present on the ground to not only condemn the rioting and the lawlessness, but also to stand up for social justice movements was something that the Trump campaign was capitalizing on. And on the heels of having virtual conventions, which I think actually both sides did a really good job. I don't agree with the messaging that was coming out of the RNC, but it was a well-produced event. It looked good. And I think they had a lot to be proud of in terms of that. I think Democrats did a nicer job, but that's unsurprising that I would think that. So I think that you are going to see more people on the ground and surrogates out there trying to have, not rallies, but small scale events where they're going to rely on word of mouth. Like we were talking about before, it's people that you trust that you're going to. So now it's over 50% of Americans will tell you that they don't trust the media. They don't trust politicians, certainly. Congress has had a 13% approval rating for over a decade now. So you're going to trust someone in your family, someone in your network. And so my understanding and being in touch with the Biden campaign is they're going to try to have as many foot soldiers out there as possible that can talk to people who can then go and keep talking and sharing on social media with their networks who will trust them. But to Danny's point, those comment sections are really where the war is going to be fought. I try not to read them, but when I do, I realize that a seemingly normal conversation is now in a Reddit thread run by a QAnon person, and it just devolves into something you never saw coming from stating a fact about what's going on as it relates to healthcare or the economy.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And what we're seeing a lot, out there in the community is the trust factor of social media. We're seeing the trust factor of social media on the decline. We hear reports every day in the paper that China, Russia, and other foreign agents are really trying to influence our politics. But the one thing that we've seen consistently and stable, at least from the politicians that we're working with here at OUTFRONT Media, is, people aren't necessarily, changing the facts which they see on outdoor advertising, because they drive by that, usually 7 words or less. Here's my message, they're retweeting it out. And I really think that that will be the explosion in the way things are going, because social media, while it's an effective tool, it's not always a reliable tool in these days. And I don't know if that will ever change. Abel, what are your thoughts, Mr. Lieutenant Governor?
Well, I agree with you, RB. But you need to understand that the president is a TV guy. That's who he is. I served under Arnold Schwarzenegger as a lieutenant governor with Arnold. He's a TV guy. If you think about it, they're both the same, and they believe, as Jessica said, they go out there, they give a little snippet on Fox News at nighttime, and then his army goes off and retweets it, send it organically to all their folks. And it was just the one thing he wanted to get out, that little message that they all working to get it out. And it has changed completely. And the president, if you dissect the guy, and I'm a Republican, and I'm a limping Republican, barely hanging on, and you look at what he does, and you have me sitting at the other side of the TV watching him. If you think about it, I'm a guy who voted for George W. Bush, I voted for Mitt Romney, and I voted for John McCain, and I'm a rhino in this party today. How does that work? So Biden's job is, how do you get that disinfected Republican, independent, moderate in those 5 swing states to say, I can come on board to support Joe, make him look a little stronger with Kamala, and say, I can help this guy. And you know what? On November the 4th, I want my life back with no chaos. Because at the end of the day, I mean, when you're sitting at home, you're just like, geez, another, here we go again. But, you know, right now, everybody's talking about Bob Woodward's tapes. A Trump voter doesn't care about the tapes. How do you get those tapes to the swingers, barely holding on Republicans in swing states? And RB, whether it be through billboards, whether it be through communications via writing or mail or TV, that's what you have to do. Because here in California, there's no secret who's going to win. But you talk to a Trump voter here in California, says, wait, Bob Woodward, I called a friend of mine this morning. Hey, there's 9 hours of tapes. Who cares? I'm voting for the guy. So how do you go to those swing states? And that's going to be Joe's challenge with Kamala and the campaign. They've got to do it quick because, I mean, it's coming.
And I think in a really interesting perspective, and you know, I think Jessica, you had mentioned that we have about 8 battleground states. You know, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Minnesota, and Georgia. If I got them all correct, you know, and how are we going to reach those voters in those specific states? That's where the bulk of the money is going to be going. That's where the bulk of our advertising dollars will be spent. But you know, is it the same message across the same demographic? And how are we micro-targeting some of these communities, right? Not all communities within the state are the same, right? And if we look in Florida, and in Florida you have, you know, the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans, and the, you know, people from like South America. And they're all different demographics, all speaking Spanish, but different people. How are we micro-targeting? How are we going to reach those voters?
Well, explain to me, Ryan, how could the polls, if they're correct, how could Trump have 32% of the Latino vote or 28% of the Latino vote when George W. Bush had 38% of the Latino vote, and his whole campaign was based around Latinos when he ran for office? It was, I mean, George Bush's campaign message was family values don't stop at the Rio Grande. Now look at this message today. Who's coming across the border? They're not sending us their best, but yet Latinos are there. So I don't know the strategy there, Brian, you're right. There's different demographics because when you have a Mexican in California or a Cuban in Miami or a Honduran in New York, they're Hispanics, but they're totally different messages. How do you get that to those folks and get them to understand what's been happening today?
And Danny, I'll put that question off to you. Danny and Eric.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, there are ways to reach each of these audiences, and I do think that's when a campaign performs the best, when you don't change the message for each part of the electorate that you're trying to reach, but you refine that message and you make sure that the issues are focused on the issues that they care about. So there are so many mechanisms. On broadcast, there are different mechanisms, but on digital, you know, there are even more to kind of really, you know, slice out that voter and make sure that when you give that message, it's more relevant and pertinent to that audience, and so they actually they agree and they get on board or they are influenced in some way. But that again, that part of the universe is shrinking so much in terms of the number of folks that you can actually convince and change minds with paid advertising. It's an incredibly important part, but it's such a small part of the electorate because there are the people that are, I love Trump and I'm never going to vote against him, and there are people that I hate Trump and I'm never going to vote for him. And so everybody's in the middle who's like who people who maybe even who voted for Trump in 2016 who are thinking now, you know what, I gave him a shot. It might be more important, and so how do you connect with that voter about why Trump did not do that job when you voted for him? Or those folks who may have voted for Hillary in 2016 or aren't sure about Biden, how do you make sure that the messaging that you're giving them, wherever they fall in terms of their demographics or their geographics or where they fall in the workforce and economic class, how do you connect with them? And there are ways to make sure that you can slice and micro-target those particular voters. You still have to have an overarching campaign message that all this falls underneath, and you got to be authentic. And Trump has that, and I think Biden has that as well, and make sure that you're connecting there. So.
Great. And Jessica, you know, I'm curious to hear your perspective also. You know, we're in the age of COVID. You know, campaigning is different. And we've seen both campaigns, the Trump campaign and the Biden-Harris campaign, take a completely different approach. Biden is very, you know, wants to wear a mask, and Trump mocks people who wear masks, good, bad, different. How do you think that's going to affect the voters?
Well, going back to what I first said is that this is a remarkably stable race. And a lot of that has to do even with just that one issue that you laid out there about mask wearing, right? With healthcare as the #1 issue, people have consistently trusted Biden to lead on who's best to handle coronavirus, who's best to deal with the country if we're in a crisis. All of that is about the public perception of this person, right? Donald Trump at rallies right now, no matter the size of them, is exactly the same person that he was in 2016. He's loud and he's brash and he's unapologetic. And his base, that 35%, is still there. Joe Biden is mild-mannered and he's empathetic and he takes his time. And he's been that way his entire career. And the people who felt connected to him over his 47 years in the Senate and then in the White House still feel that. But what Danny said about the people who like Trump and the people who like Biden is so critical and different this time around than last time. We have 95% of the electorate that's decided, their mind is made up. And that really influences how advertising is working this time around, because you had over 30% that was heading to election day saying, I don't really like either of these candidates and I don't know what I'm going to do. Joe Biden doesn't suffer from that problem that Hillary Clinton did. He has much higher favorables. Now, I think that we could do a whole other panel and I would be thrilled to participate about how unfair it was the way the media treated her and how this perception of her was created over decades of, frankly, her husband's wrongdoing. I don't, if my husband cheated on me, I certainly wouldn't want to be blamed for that. But she ended up having to deal with all of these issues and it made a lot of people dislike her. Biden isn't suffering from that. He's leading amongst people who dislike both candidates by about 60 points at this stage. So I think that their different approaches are working for them. Trump's a little bit less, and you can see why his team encourages him to appear empathetic. I mean, we've even saw one day, remember he had notes that showed up, someone got a picture of them and it said like, show sympathy. You know, they know that this is Biden's big skill, that he can talk about it, especially with healthcare and the death of his son to glioblastoma. So that's my take on how it's working for them.
Eric J., what are your perspectives, Eric?
Well, I mean, I think that the facts are intervening to upset our advertising strategies on one level, right? What we say, what we pay to have people hear is very weak in comparison to their lived experience. And really, you know, history is starting to intervene here. We're not understanding what's happening in our country through media or through paid advertising. We understand what's happening in our country through, you know, loved ones getting sick from COVID-19, or people losing their jobs, or people losing their health care because they've lost their jobs. And I think that's really the one of the unknown factors in this election is how the facts on the ground of mass unemployment, closed schools, and the other, you know, real disruption that people are feeling in their lives, how they're going to react to it. Are they going to want someone who's empathetic, or are they going to want someone who is strong? And what I would be cautious about from the Biden perspective is the history of this country is generally to choose strength over empathy. And I think Trump is doubling down on that. I also think that, you know, there is a class war going on in this country. And we don't talk about it because we're not really used to talking about class in America. But Trump's ability to tap into class resentment is tremendously powerful. And the disdain that Democratic Party elites, and frankly, some Republican Party elites have for working class voters is remained. And they know we have called them deplorable and continue to call them deplorable. And if Trump wins, and I think it's a 50-50 chance that he will, you know, Arby, I know you're a movie buff. I mean, this is going to be Revenge of the Deplorables Part 2, right? And I think that's the script being written, and I am, as a Democrat, extremely anxious about it.
Thank you. Danny, any comments?
No, I agree with all those reasons, and you know, go back to the targeting piece in terms of like the micro targeting piece and how we're kind of slicing and dicing all these voters and pulling them into the categories in terms of class and demographics and geographics and things like that, and how a voter in a working class neighborhood might feel differently and get different messages somewhere else. I would just say there's also what I think we as a party have done too much is over targeting. And I think we just need that larger cohesive message that can go wider and broader. I think we got ourselves back into a corner where we knew exactly who that audience is, or we thought we knew who that audience was in 2016. And I think what we need to do now is there needs to be a national cohesive message. And I agree, like there needs to be some strength and there needs to be some empathy in those messages to make sure that we are covering our bases, because even though we think we know who those persuadables might be, there's a hidden electorate out there that was in 2016 that's going to be there in 2020. The people who said, you know what, I considered and I voted for Trump in 2016, and you know what, in 2020, I'm, you know, even though he's done all of these things and he is that character he is, which we know a lot about his character, a lot more about his character now than we did then. I think it's relatively similar. They still might go into that voting booth and vote for him. And so knowing who those hidden voters are who aren't saying I'm going to vote for this person or that person, and really trying to having a national, strong, empathetic, cohesive message is really going to be is important. And I think the campaign's done pretty well at that. How this campaign is versus maybe the 2016 campaign. So.
And, you know, you mentioned 2016 campaign, and we have a question from one of our audience. Is, you know, how does a major election year change your media strategy? 2018 is different from 2020, and 2016 is probably more so 2020.
I guess I could take the first crack at that. I mean, I think what 2020 brings that 2016 was a little different. I think, you know, we're communicating in a lot more places, I believe. You know, broadcast and cable television, that landscape has changed a lot. I do think cable news and sports are strong, but with this year, with a lot of sports being very, very different than we've seen in the past, that's not an outlet for us. With no news shows, that is not an outlet for us. News on broadcast and news on cable will be strong players, but how do you find ways to connect, and especially connect with those voters who are turning off the TV from the so I think connected TV, digital video is going to be a big piece. How we kind of communicate on social is going to be different. I don't think Facebook is the best place for just slapping a video up that you're the same video they're slapping on TV. People don't engage with that. And so how do you make sure that the content you produce kind of really fits the space? And so there are a lot more spaces to do that, or the media is fragmented in terms of like where people are getting their choices, whether it's based on demographics and age. And so making sure that you're covering all of those bases is more important than ever. And that just means there are more platforms, and with more money coming into politics than ever, you're able to kind of spread that out. It just becomes a bear to handle all those different things and make sure you have the content ready and the budget ready to kind of cover all those pieces.
Yeah, just amplifying what Danny just said, RB, I think that, you know, one thing of a presidential election is the scale. You know, more people vote than in the off year. And so you're dealing with 70% more, you know, an audience that's 70% larger. And I also think the loss of live events has really hurt our ability to build a reach. You know, as a San Franciscan, I'm a Giants fan. It's, you know, one of the few times during the week in a Giants game where you can actually reach people of all parties, of all generations, of all ethnicities. You know, losing that audience has made our life a lot harder. And even though it is anxiety producing, because it is a little bit creepy, the one thing that's happened this year is we just have more ability to target people based on their devices. So if someone has been at the unemployment office, we were able to target that person because they were at the unemployment office and serve them a message about job creation. So just the ability for the time being to target people based on their location, that's new. And that's giving us a lot more tools to build an audience around a shared interest.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining at the panel today, influenced by OUTFRONT. This has been an incredible conversation and a useful tool for all of us. Eric, Jessica, Danny, and Mr. Lieutenant Governor, thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next installment.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Ryan.